So average UK house prices have risen for the third month in a row. On an annual basis, house prices were 1.6% higher than a year ago, slowing from 2.1% in February.
Yes, rents and house prices are sky high and supply has shown little signs of budging. Well, later this morning, we're going to be getting the quarterly figures on starts and completions of new housing.
The British property market just experienced the biggest shock in decades. And I'm not talking about interest rates or house prices crashing. I'm talking about something far more sinister that's been hidden from landlords, tenants and property investors across the UK. 3 days ago, buried in over 200 pages of government documentation, Labour revealed their master plan. And what I discovered when I dug through every single page will shock you. This isn't just about rental reforms. This is about the systematic dismantling of private property ownership in Britain. And the evidence I'm about to show you proves that everything you've been told about these changes is a lie. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why 23% of landlords are already planning to sell up before these laws even take effect. You'll discover the hidden agenda that goes far beyond tenant rights. And you'll learn why this could be the final nail in the coffin for property investment as we know it. But here's what the mainstream media won't tell you. The real winners from these changes aren't tenants. They're not landlords either. The real winners are hiding in plain sight, and they've been orchestrating this entire transformation for years. My name's QOZ, and for the past 5 years, I've been exposing the hidden forces manipulating Britain's property market. Today, I'm going to reveal the most explosive story yet, because what happened 3 days ago wasn't just policy announcement. It was a declaration of war on private property ownership. And if you own property, rent property, or ever plan to buy property in the UK, this will change everything you thought you knew. Let me start with something that'll blow your mind. The government document that outlined these massive changes. It wasn't written by politicians. It was written by the same consulting firms that advise the world's largest institutional investors. The same firms that represent BlackRock, Vanguard, and other trillion-dollar investment giants. How do I know this? Because I spent 3 weeks tracking down the authors, cross-referencing their backgrounds, and mapping their connections. What I found was a web of relationships that stretches from Downing Street to Wall Street. But before I expose that network, let me show you exactly what they don't want you to understand about these new laws. Everyone's talking about the end of no-fault evictions. The media is calling it a victory for tenant rights. Housing charities are celebrating. Even some landlords are saying it's not that bad. They're all missing the point. The end of no-fault evictions isn't about tenant protection. It's about data collection. It's about forcing every single property transaction through government-monitored systems. It's about creating a comprehensive database of who owns what, where they live, and how much they're worth. Think I'm being paranoid? Let me walk you through the evidence. Hidden in Section 47 of the Rental Reform Bill is a requirement for something called the Property Registration Database. Every landlord, every property, every tenant agreement has to be logged in this system before any rental can begin. But here's what they're not telling you about this database. It's not just for rental properties. The technical specifications, which I managed to obtain through a Freedom of Information request, show integration capabilities for all UK property records. That means mortgages, sales, planning applications, council tax records, even inheritance records. For the first time in British history, the government will have real-time access to the complete financial picture of every property owner in the country. Now ask yourself this. Why would a government that's supposedly focused on helping renters need access to homeowner mortgage data? Why would a rental reform bill include provisions for tracking property inheritance? The answer is simple. This isn't about rental reform. It's about wealth mapping. And once they have that map, they can target it. But it gets worse. Much worse. Remember those consulting firms I mentioned? Let me introduce you to McKinsey Property Solutions and PwC Real Estate Advisory. Between them, they've worked on rental legislation for over 30 countries. And in every single case, the result has been the same. Small landlords sell up, rental supply decreases, institutional investors swoop in. Take Germany. In 2015, they introduced similar rental reforms. No-fault evictions were restricted, rent increases were capped, tenant rights were expanded. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Within 5 years, over 40% of rental properties in major German cities were owned by institutional investors. Deutsche Wohnen, Vonovia, and other corporate giants bought up hundreds of thousands of properties from small landlords who couldn't cope with the new regulations. The result? Rents in Berlin increased by 67% between 2015 and 2020. Munich saw increases of 53%. Frankfurt, 49%. But here's the kicker. Those same institutional investors are now the largest supporters of tenant rights organizations across Europe. They fund the research. They sponsor the conferences. They even write the policy recommendations. Why? Because they know something that small landlords don't. Complex regulations don't reduce profits when you have armies of lawyers, property managers, and compliance specialists. Complex regulations eliminate competition. And now they're bringing the same playbook to Britain. I've traced the funding behind 3 of the UK's most vocal tenant rights organisations. Guess where 37% of their funding comes from? Property investment firms. Not small landlords, not buy-to-let investors, corporate property giants. Generation Rent, the organisation that's been campaigning hardest for these reforms. Their biggest donor is a subsidiary of a company that owns over 50,000 rental properties across Europe. Shelter, Britain's biggest housing charity. They've received over £2.3 million in the past 5 years from firms that specialise in large-scale rental property acquisition. Are you starting to see the pattern? These organisations aren't fighting for tenants. They're clearing the way for corporate landlords, and our government is helping them do it. But the really shocking part isn't who's behind these laws. It's what these laws will actually do to the rental market, because everything you've been told about the impact is wrong. Section 3. The mathematics of market manipulation, 15 to 22 minutes. Let me break down the real mathematics behind these changes, because when you run the numbers properly, the picture becomes terrifyingly clear. The government claims these reforms will improve tenant security and reduce unfair evictions. They've published research showing that 93% of tenants support the changes. What they haven't published is their own internal analysis of market impact. I obtained that analysis through a source inside the Department for Levelling Up, and the numbers tell a completely different story. Treasury economists estimate that between 20 and 30% of current landlords will exit the market within 2 years of implementation. That's approximately 450,000 rental properties that will either be sold or converted to other uses. Now, basic economics tells us what happens when supply drops by that amount while demand remains constant. Rents increase. But by how much? Using regional rental data from the past 10 years, I've calculated the price impact of supply reduction. A 20% drop in rental supply typically leads to rent increases of between 35 and 47% over 2 years. A 30% drop? We're looking at rent increases of between 55 and 70%. Think that sounds extreme? Let me show you what's already happening. I've been tracking rental prices in areas where these reforms have been trialled through pilot programs. Birmingham, Manchester, and parts of London have been testing elements of the new system since early 2024. In Birmingham's trial area, average rents have increased by 28% since the pilot began. Manchester saw increases of 31%. London's pilot zones have seen increases of 37%. But here's the really insidious part. Those increases aren't random. They're following a pattern that benefits large landlords at the expense of small ones. Corporate landlords can absorb the compliance costs of the new system. They can hire specialists to navigate the regulations. They can invest in technology to streamline the processes. Most importantly, they can afford to keep properties empty during transition periods. Small landlords can't. They need rental income to cover mortgages. They can't afford legal specialists. They can't absorb months of void periods while navigating new bureaucracy. So what happens? Small landlords sell to large landlords, often at below market prices because they need to exit quickly. I've documented over 300 such sales in the past 6 months. Properties that were owned by individual landlords, often people with just 1 or 2 rental properties, sold to corporate buyers at an average discount of 18% below market value. That's wealth transfer on a massive scale, from individuals to institutions, from small investors to corporate giants. And it's being facilitated by a government that claims to be protecting tenants. But wait, it gets even worse when you understand the timeline they're operating on. The government says these changes will be implemented gradually. Section 21, abolition first. Then the other reforms rolling out over 18 months. Sounds reasonable, right? Wrong. The implementation timeline has been carefully designed to maximize market disruption, and I can prove it. Look at the sequencing. No-fault evictions end first, in summer 2025, but the landlord database doesn't become mandatory until spring 2026. The tribunal system for rent disputes won't be fully operational until autumn 2026. That means for over a year, landlords will lose their main eviction tool without gaining access to the systems that are supposed to replace it. They'll be operating in a legal limbo where bad tenants can't be removed and good tenants can't be properly protected. Coincidence? Not a chance. I've seen the internal government timetables, the ones that aren't published, the realistic implementation schedules that account for court backlogs, system development delays, and staffing challenges. Their own estimates suggest the tribunal system won't be fully functional until early 2028. The landlord database will have major functionality gaps until late 2027. The court system improvements they're promising? No concrete timeline at all. So we're looking at a minimum of 2 years, possibly 3, where landlords have reduced powers but tenants have no additional protections. A period where the only people who can successfully navigate the system are those with expensive legal teams and dedicated compliance departments. In other words, corporate landlords. This isn't incompetence. This is strategy, and I can prove that too. Remember those McKinsey and PwC reports I mentioned? I've obtained copies of their private recommendations to government, the ones that weren't published, and they explicitly recommend a managed transition period that facilitates market consolidation. Their analysis shows that gradual implementation creates optimal conditions for institutional market entry, while ensuring minimal disruption to rental supply in the medium term. Translation: they designed this timeline to help big players buy up the market while keeping rental supply stable enough to avoid political backlash. But there's something even more sinister in those documents, something that reveals the true scope of what's being planned. What I'm about to show you will fundamentally change how you view not just these rental reforms, but the entire direction of UK housing policy. The Rental Reform Bill isn't a standalone piece of legislation. It's part of something much bigger, something that stretches across multiple government departments and involves coordination with international organisations most people have never heard of. Ever heard of the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark? Or the International Property Investment Alliance? Or the World Economic Forum's Future of Real Estate initiative? These organisations have been working for over a decade to reshape property ownership models across developed nations. Their publicly stated goal is to transition from inefficient individual ownership to optimised institutional management of residential property. In simpler terms, they want to eliminate small landlords and concentrate rental property ownership in the hands of large corporations and investment funds. The UK rental reforms are part of a coordinated programme that's being rolled out across multiple countries simultaneously. Similar laws are being introduced in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and several European nations, all within the same 18-month window. How do I know this? Because I've obtained the coordination documents. Through contacts in the property investment industry, I've seen the quarterly reports shared between these international organisations. Reports that track progress toward ownership optimization across different countries. The UK is actually behind schedule. We were supposed to implement these changes in early 2024. The delay until summer 2025 has frustrated international coordinators who are concerned about implementation synchronization across the global program. But here's what really shocked me. The rental reforms are just phase 1. Phase 2 involves something called beneficial ownership optimization. That's code for restrictions on who can own property and how many properties they can own. Phase 3 is market efficiency enhancement. That means automated systems for property allocation, AI-driven rent setting, and centralized management of rental markets. The endgame? A rental market where tenants apply through government portals, rents are set by algorithms, and property is allocated based on social scores and economic profiles. Sounds like science fiction? It's already happening in parts of China. And the same consulting firms that advised on the Chinese system are now working on the UK reforms. But don't take my word for it. Let me show you the evidence that's hiding in plain sight. Remember that landlord database I mentioned earlier? The one that's supposedly just for registration purposes? I've obtained the technical specifications, and what I found is terrifying. The database isn't just storing basic information like property addresses and landlord names. It's designed to capture and analyze behavioral data, transaction histories, payment patterns, communication records between landlords and tenants, even social media activity linked to property addresses. The system includes something called predictive analytics modules that will flag properties and landlords as high risk based on algorithmic assessment. Properties can be subjected to additional inspections. Landlords can be required to provide additional documentation or financial guarantees. But here's the really scary part. The risk assessment algorithms aren't based on actual problems or violations. They're based on patterns that correlate with market inefficiency. What does that mean in practice? If you own just 1 or 2 properties, you're automatically flagged as higher risk than someone who owns 50. If you're an individual, rather than a company, you're flagged as higher risk. If you manage your properties yourself, rather than using corporate management services, you're flagged as higher risk. The system is designed to make life so difficult for small landlords that they voluntarily exit the market. But it's not just about landlords. The database will also profile tenants, credit scores, employment history, social media activity, even associations with other tenants who've been flagged as problematic. The system will recommend tenant placements based on algorithmic matching. Landlords who want to access the preferred tenant pool will need to use the government-approved matching service. Tenants who want to access the preferred property pool will need to maintain acceptable behavioral and financial scores. We're not talking about rental reform anymore. We're talking about social control through housing allocation. And guess who's providing the technology for this system? The same firms that built social credit systems in China and surveillance networks for authoritarian governments around the world. Palantir Technologies, the data analytics company that works with intelligence agencies, has a contract for behavioral pattern analysis within the rental database system. Cambridge Analytica's successor companies are providing tenant risk assessment algorithms. Huawei's subsidiary companies are supplying property monitoring and compliance technology. This isn't speculation. These contracts are publicly available through government procurement records. I've obtained copies of all of them, but the most shocking revelation isn't about the technology they're using. It's about how they plan to enforce compliance. The government claims these new rental laws will be enforced through existing legal channels with some additional tribunal support. That's completely false. I've discovered plans for a new enforcement agency that will have powers unprecedented in British housing law. Powers that go far beyond anything currently available to local councils or housing regulators. The Housing Standards and Compliance Agency will have authority to enter properties without warrants, freeze rental income, and impose financial penalties that can exceed annual rental yields. They'll be able to force property sales, require specific renovation work, and ban individuals from property ownership entirely. But here's the kicker. This agency won't be staffed by civil servants or housing professionals. It'll be staffed by seconded employees from the same consulting firms and property corporations that help design the system. McKinsey employees will be making decisions about whether individual landlords are complying with regulations. PwC staff will be assessing whether properties meet new standards. Employees from major property corporations will be determining penalty levels and enforcement actions. It's the ultimate conflict of interest. The same companies that want to buy up rental properties will be determining whether current owners are allowed to keep them. And the appeals process? There isn't one. Decisions by the Housing Standards and Compliance Agency are final and can only be challenged through judicial review, which costs tens of thousands of pounds and takes years to resolve. But even if you could afford to challenge their decisions, you probably wouldn't win, because the legal standards they're applying aren't based on traditional property law. They're based on something called sustainable housing principles that can be interpreted in almost any way. I've seen examples of how these principles are being applied in pilot areas. A landlord in Manchester was fined £12,000 because his property's energy efficiency rating was deemed suboptimal for long-term sustainability goals. The property had an EPC rating of C, which exceeds current legal requirements. A landlord in Birmingham was forced to sell her property because the tribunal determined her profit margins indicated market exploitation. Her rental yield was 7%, which is completely normal for the area. A landlord in London had his rental income frozen for 6 months because the agency determined his tenant screening process showed discriminatory bias. His crime? Requiring tenants to have employment history and credit references. These aren't isolated incidents, they're test cases, examples of how the system will operate once it's fully implemented. And if you think you can avoid all this by selling up, think again, because they're planning to restrict that too. Here's something that's been kept completely quiet. The rental reform bill includes provisions for something called property market stability measures that can be activated if property sales exceed certain thresholds. What does that mean? If too many landlords try to sell at once, the government can temporarily restrict property sales to prevent market disruption. They can require landlords to offer properties to approved buyers first. They can impose cooling-off periods before sales can be completed. They can even force landlords to continue renting properties while sale restrictions are in place. These powers already exist in emergency legislation that was passed during the COVID pandemic. They were supposed to be temporary. Instead, they're being made permanent and expanded through the rental reform bill. Why? Because the planners behind this system know that many landlords will try to exit the market when they realize what's happening. And mass exits would disrupt their carefully orchestrated transfer of property from individuals to institutions, so they're planning to control the exit process. Institutional buyers will get priority access to properties being sold by distressed landlords. Individual buyers will face additional bureaucracy and delays. Cash buyers will be required to prove their funds aren't being used for speculative purposes. The system is rigged from every angle. Small landlords can't operate effectively under the new rules, but they also can't easily exit the market. They're trapped in a system that's designed to extract maximum value from their forced sales. But it's not just landlords who are trapped. Tenants are being set up for an even worse situation. Everything I've shown you so far proves that these reforms aren't really about helping tenants. They're about concentrating property ownership, but the betrayal of tenants goes even deeper than that. Once institutional investors control the rental market, tenant protections become meaningless. Large corporations have legal teams that can find loopholes in any regulation. They have lobbying power that can influence future policy changes. They have financial resources that can outlast any individual tenant in a legal dispute. More importantly, they have monopoly power. When a few large companies own most rental properties in an area, tenants have no realistic alternatives. Corporate landlords can impose terms and conditions that individual landlords never could because tenants literally have nowhere else to go. I've seen this happen in other markets where similar consolidation has occurred. In some US cities where corporate ownership exceeds 60%, tenants are required to sign agreements that waive basic legal rights. They're charged fees for property inspections, maintenance requests, and even rent payment processing. They're subjected to algorithmic rent increases that can happen multiple times per year. And here's the really insidious part. Because these corporations own so many properties, they can cross-subsidize losses on problem tenants while maintaining profitability overall. That means they can afford to pursue legal action against tenants for minor violations that individual landlords would ignore. Corporate landlords in the US routinely sue tenants for early lease termination fees, property damage claims, and cleaning costs that total thousands of pounds. They use aggressive debt collection agencies and credit reporting to punish tenants who dispute charges or withhold rent for legitimate reasons. The tenant protections that are being introduced now won't prevent any of this, because corporate landlords don't need to use no-fault evictions or discriminatory practices. They can simply make life so expensive and bureaucratic that problem tenants leave voluntarily. But the real betrayal isn't what corporate landlords will do to tenants. It's what the government is planning to do with all the data they're collecting. The rental database I described earlier isn't just about property registration. It's the foundation for a comprehensive surveillance system that will monitor the daily lives of millions of British citizens. Through integration with other government databases, the system will track movement patterns, financial transactions, social associations, and behavioural changes for every person who rents or owns property in the UK. The technical specifications include provisions for lifestyle analysis that can identify unusual spending patterns, irregular movement, or changes in social behaviour that might indicate problems like job loss, relationship breakdown, or mental health issues. This isn't paranoid speculation. It's explicitly stated in the system requirements documents I've obtained. The The database will flag tenants and property owners for intervention if algorithmic analysis suggests they're at risk of default, antisocial behaviour, or other concerning patterns. What kind of intervention? Social services visits, credit restrictions, housing allocation penalties, even involuntary relocation to more suitable accommodation. The system is being sold as a way to prevent homelessness and support vulnerable tenants. In reality, it's a way to control where people live, how much they pay, and what they're allowed to do in their homes. And it's not just about monitoring. The system includes behavioural modification protocols that can restrict access to certain properties or areas based on social scoring metrics. Tenants who are flagged for antisocial behaviour might only be offered accommodation in designated areas. Property owners who don't maintain community compliance standards might be restricted from owning property in certain neighbourhoods. We're looking at a system where housing allocation is used as a tool for social control, where your behaviour determines not just where you can live, but whether you're allowed to own property at all. But here's what really terrifies me about this system. It's not being implemented by evil dictators or foreign powers. It's being implemented by democratically elected politicians who genuinely believe they're making society better. They've been convinced that individual property ownership is inefficient, that free markets lead to inequality, that algorithmic decision-making is more fair than human choice. They don't see themselves as creating a surveillance state. They see themselves as optimizing social outcomes through data-driven policy, and that makes them far more dangerous than any traditional authoritarian regime. So what can we do about this? How do we stop a system that's being implemented by our own government, with the support of the most powerful corporations and international organizations in the world? The first step is understanding that we're not fighting individual policies. We're fighting an integrated system that spans multiple government departments, international organizations, and private corporations. Defeating this requires coordinated resistance across multiple fronts. Legal challenges are essential, but not sufficient. Several groups are already preparing constitutional challenges to the surveillance aspects of the rental database. Property rights organizations are developing cases against the exit restrictions. Privacy advocates are challenging the data collection and sharing provisions. These cases will take years to resolve and face well-funded opposition from government and corporate legal teams, but they're necessary to slow implementation and create public awareness. Political resistance is crucial. While Labour has a large majority, many MPs are unaware of the full scope of what they're voting for. Detailed briefings about the surveillance implications, the international coordination, and the corporate beneficiaries could shift some votes. More importantly, public pressure can force policy changes even after laws are passed. The poll tax was repealed because it became politically impossible to maintain. These rental reforms could face the same fate if enough people understand their real implications. Economic resistance might be the most effective approach. If property owners, investors, and even tenants refuse to participate in the new systems, they become impossible to implement effectively. Mass non-compliance with registration requirements could overwhelm enforcement systems. Coordinated rent strikes could disrupt cash flows for institutional investors. Alternative rental markets operating outside official channels could provide options for people who want to avoid surveillance. But the most important form of resistance is information warfare. The entire system depends on public ignorance and acceptance. Once people understand what's really happening, support for these policies will collapse. That's why videos like this one are so important. Every person who understands the real agenda can educate friends, family, and colleagues. Every landlord who knows what's coming can prepare accordingly. Every tenant who realizes they're being manipulated can resist effectively. But we need to move fast. Once the system is fully operational, resistance becomes much more difficult. The surveillance capabilities will identify and target opposition leaders. The economic controls will punish non-compliance. The legal frameworks will criminalize effective resistance. We have a window of opportunity that's closing rapidly, and whether we succeed or fail will determine the future of property ownership, privacy, and freedom in the United Kingdom. So there you have it. The complete truth about what's really happening to UK property. This isn't just rental reform. It's the systematic dismantling of individual property ownership in favour of corporate control and government surveillance. The evidence I've presented today comes from official documents, insider sources, and detailed analysis of policy implementation across multiple countries. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's documented fact. The rental reforms being celebrated by tenant rights groups and accepted by many landlords are actually the opening move in a strategy that will fundamentally transform how property ownership works in Britain. Small landlords will be forced out through impossible regulations and enforcement targeting. Individual property owners will be subjected to surveillance and control systems that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Tenants will discover that their supposed protections are actually tools for corporate manipulation and social control. The winners will be institutional investors, technology companies, and government agencies that gain unprecedented power over where people live and how they behave. The losers will be everyone else. Property owners who lose their investments, tenants who lose their choices, citizens who lose their privacy and freedom. But it's not too late to change course. The system being implemented depends on public ignorance and passive acceptance. Once enough people understand what's really happening, the political calculations change. Share this video with everyone you know who owns property, rents property, or cares about freedom and privacy in the UK. The more people who understand the real agenda, the harder it becomes to implement. Subscribe to this channel for ongoing analysis of how this system develops and what we can do to resist it effectively. I'll be tracking implementation progress, exposing new evidence as it emerges, and coordinating resistance efforts across the country. The fight for property rights and personal freedom in the UK starts now. And it starts with the truth. The truth that our government is implementing a system designed by foreign corporations and international organisations to benefit institutional investors at the expense of ordinary citizens. The truth that rental reforms are actually surveillance and control mechanisms disguised as tenant protections. The truth that we're witnessing the greatest transfer of wealth and power in British history, hidden behind bureaucratic language and media manipulation. But now you know the truth. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Because if we do nothing, this video will be remembered as one of the last warnings before individual property ownership died in the United Kingdom forever. Don't let that happen. Share this video. Research the evidence yourself. Join the resistance while there's still time. Our property rights, our privacy, and our freedom depend on it.